Good morning, folks. Seems we had some technical issues there and the sound was not up. So let me restart this. Good morning for those of you that have joined us here and have stuck with us through the no sound. Hopefully we've got that sorted now. So this morning we're going to be featuring a conversation between Captain Jan Miles of Pride of Baltimore and Captain Phil Watson of the Bluenose II. So without further ado, I will switch back to that conversation for your guys' viewing pleasure.
So Jan Miles here aboard Pride of Baltimore II. We have our guest today, Captain Phil Watson of the Bluenose II. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, Jan. How are you today?
I'm good. So as you can see in the background for me, I'm aboard the deck of Pride. She's all laid up.
I'm getting
It's the 4th of November, and we wouldn't normally be as covered over as we are right now. We've been covered over since mid-June of this year. What's the story? We were sailing before that. We crewed up starting in mid-February. And we were getting ready to do the big kickoff for Maryland Day, which is the 25th of March. Go down to Annapolis, reintroduce ourselves to the General Assembly of Maryland at the state capitol in Annapolis, and we got shut down because of the pandemic. So, what's the story over there at Nova Scotia and the Bluenose II for the pandemic?
Well, there you go. Well, today I wouldn't be sitting on deck. We actually had our first snow last night, sort of 10 centimeters up in Halifax. So I'm much happy to be sitting in the office today and undercover.
Yeah. So how'd you guys go for the year? Yeah,
we started. We usually in a normal year would start April 1st, but that's still within snow season for us. But with the amount of work that you have to have done, and we like to start sailing around the 1st of June. So that's 2 months to crew up and train the crew and get the ship up and going. This year with COVID didn't happen. We sat around like the rest of the world and, wrung our hands, and we were greatly heartened when you guys started to sail. And, we certainly, as our season went on, we modeled ourselves after, as we often do, after the Pride. But we sat here, both for regulatory reasons and just for, just to see what was going to happen until we could find a way forward. In that time, and certainly here, and I think around the world, there was a lot of Facebook science going on. So we really tried to, when we made a decision that we wanted to move forward, we stepped away from that. And we hired in a firm called Praxis and a Dr. John Ross, who in this area, big fishing community, he was the one responsible for getting all the fishing boats off the wharf and finding a way forward to do it safely. And certainly, looking at the West Coast, there were a couple of factory trawlers that sort of set off thinking they were okay, and then he had mass infections in the crew. And so we wanted to avoid that situation, obviously. So we sat there and watched the Pride sail, and then we watched the Pride tie up again. We didn't know what to do, so we found a way forward. No public on the boat this year, and to really use the boat. And again, I keep saying this over and over, the Pride model, but it really was the idea to go out and remind Nova Scotians that they are strong and resilient, and that their history shows that, and the future should show it as well. So, before anybody showed up on June 12th, we basically all went into self-isolation within our homes as much as we could. The majority of the crew, most years, comes from Nova Scotia. We're a government-owned vessel, but we're managed by a separate museum society. So it's the taxpayers' kids that get to go sailing often. They give us sort of half to 2/3 of the budget the government does. So most of us were from Nova Scotia, so we didn't have a whole lot of cases here. We isolated in our homes for 2 weeks, showed up on the ship June 12th, and that was 4 people living on the ship. So there's 1 mate and 3 deckhands lived on the ship. The rest of us were within traveling distance. masks all the time, wash the groceries, wash your hands, all the precautions possible. Yeah. So we did that for 2 weeks, and by then, temperatures every day. Figured out that we had created our own work bubble. So once that was all right, then we, people that wanted to move on the ship could. And we did a month refit. So half the time of our normal 2-month refit. And that included bending on a brand new set of sails that we'd had made the winter before. So it was when you start looking, you have to wash every box of cereal that comes aboard and all your vegetables. But I mean, you would normally anyway, but more so. And so that certainly adds time to it. And we had 2 new mates this year. That was wow. They were on a learning curve as well. And as is normal with us, 3/4 of our crew are brand new, not only to the ship but to sailing any size ship at all. So every year we have a Right.
So going to those logistics, we were already crewed up, so we had our own bubble to start with, because we crewed up before the pandemic actually arrived. The virus really arrived in this part of the country, so behind the chain link fence and already fully crewed during our uprig period. This is at the end of our uprig period. And just as our shakedown sails were getting ready to go down to Annapolis, we were already in our own bubble. So that made it possible for us to sit out the shutdown that was organized by the governor, and then go sailing after he opened up the shutdown, but not go to the public, just sail around showing off. But in the meantime, it had been determined that economically we couldn't carry on. Our budgeting is somewhat less from government support than you described. Also, the state no longer owns the boat; the nonprofit owns the boat. So there's always this this balance of generating our own and getting some assistance both privately and publicly as the people's boat struggle. So we had to shut down, but we're getting ready to think about 2021, have been thinking about 2021 for ever since. But so you have I think Jeff has a graphic of where you sailed. Jeff, can you pull that up? Well, you can see us. Okay, there you go. Yeah, that's
there.
Great.
You go. Yes.
So in terms of scheduling, how did you? What was your model? Was it pretty much motor somewhere and then demonstrate sail, or did you actually do some cruising?
It was a bit of both. It started out that the idea was we sort of broke it up into 2-week sections, figuring that if anything changed, we'd be back in Lunenburg and we could just shut the ship down. And the idea was that we would sail and sort of just show up at a place and say, "Hi, here we are," and isn't this fantastic? And as the summer went on, and we started sort of doing these little sails in and out of all the little coves in Nova Scotia, people started looking for us and wanting to know when we were going to be there, and the office would be, well, when are you going to be in this cove, and when are you going to be in that cove, and now all of a sudden you're working out mileage and ETAs and how far around this point before we can get into the next cove, because there's a bunch of kids standing on a wharf or on a boat. Or so as the summer went on, we did less and less sailing and more ETA management.
Wow.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it's good and bad, but the purpose of the boat is to be seen, and it's not for me to enjoy sailing. And so it's so we had some great sails this summer, and then we had days where we were motor sailing around the next headland and sticking our nose in a cove, and then managing, we sort of even our ETAs to arrive at the final. We'd anchor every evening. We're quite fluid, and then you start to realize that there's 40 or 50 boats coming out with 4 or 5 people in a boat, and and those people need time to get off work and get down to the boat and to get out to meet you. And so you can't just show up at 4 o'clock. You've got to show up at 6:30 or 7 o'clock. And it was, that part of it was really interesting, was the, I guess we just didn't know what to expect when we headed out. So we went up, we left Lunenburg.
Learn by doing as you realize the parameters and the setups for the arrivals, particularly when you're having to take into account that detail. That's a very interesting sort of a truth, and sort of in reflection obvious, but not obvious to start off with, because you've got your own work a day. You know, the crew go full on at, say, soon after breakfast, and they're usually able to be stood down soon after dinner. If you're going to go to anchor, you want to anchor ahead of time so that people can sit around and do dinner, and you're not working through dinner. And then you realize that your audience is stuck with the same dynamics. So which group trumps? Well, the audience, of course, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you have to do meals and shifts, and your day is longer. And it go into a watch system, I guess, even on a day-by-day basis. So interesting, cool. So did you have a sense of which end of Nova Scotia to focus on based on as the summer progressed? Those are pretty random, east and west.
It was a basically, so we divided the province into 3 sections. It was from Lunenburg into the Bay of Fundy, and then back to Lunenburg. There was Mahone Bay, St. Margaret's Bay, Halifax area in that little part of the coast, and then all the way up around Cape North. We did the Bay of Fundy section first. Basically, because we were going to be fairly close to home, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Right.
You know, we ended up we went to Digby first, and then pushed all the way up in the Bay of Fundy, Advocate, the New Brunswick coast, down to Grand Manan, and then I think tropical storm, was it Isaias, came along, and that looked like it was going to push up the Bay of Fundy. So we bailed and went back to Lunenburg. So that was, it was two-day jaunt back, and it turned up into, I guess, Maine, New Hampshire, and we went back down to Yarmouth and bumped up the coast again. I think the big deciding factor about all of that, about which way to go, was because the crew and the mates are fairly green. I wanted fairly easy conditions, and the big trip for us was going around the top of Cape Breton. Around Cape North. So I wanted to push that off later into the season, when I had a bit more feeling about what the mates were like and what the crew were like. And,
So and then you guys didn't rig up all the way that we normally see, like we saw you back in the Great Lakes last year. What was the deciding factor of not putting up topmast?
There was 2 things. One was time, because we had we'd taken them down after the Great Lakes year. Because as you know, for us to go up into the lakes, I think we did 8 topmast moves. So the crew were really good at it. So we thought, what a great time to take them down, and do the wire and check the masts over, and just normal maintenance that you do. And then COVID came, and we're starting a month late or 2 months late, and got 2 brand new mates, and only a month refit, and had to bend on new sails. So it was a time and experience thing.
So your normal routine is topmast don't come down every winter?
No, that's right. We leave them up most years and bring them down 4 or 5 years, depending on, or if the survey deems that they need to be done. But
yeah, with all that up and down during the Great Lakes visit, I can see the logic of let's use our knowledge to get them down for the winter.
Yes.
But let's be a little bit careful the next year, because we don't have that much time and want to get her done. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they're big sticks. They're 50 feet long or 52 feet long, and weigh 1,200 pounds or so, maybe a bit more. So it's not just a chuck them up and chuck them down thing for us. So we try to be fairly careful about what we do. And
so the Bluenose II is a very large boat compared to Pride of Baltimore II in all kinds of ways. And the legacy has been going on for a long time. Now, next year, you guys are going to celebrate the launching of the original Bluenose?
Yeah, that's 100 years. 100 years. This year actually was 100 years of the first races between the Gloucester fishermen and the Lunenburg fishermen on their bank schooners. Yeah. So that was the case where the Americans won the first year, and so that was the push to build Bluenose was to win that trophy back. So it's always easier to design a winning boat after the rules are laid down. You can work out what that maximum waterline length is, and
well, of course,
yeah. So
those vessels, both sides of the border, were all working vessels. And when did the Bluenose II legacy transition from being a commercial vessel that had developed a huge reputation nationally to a symbolic representation vessel? When did that occur, and how did that occur?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Before she could race in 21, she had to make a fishing trip. So they were commercial vessels that raced, and then she won that first series of races in 21. And I think her history started then. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
That was at the end of really the age of sail. I guess it carried on a bit longer here, but in those days they were taking 400-foot steamships through the Welland Canal.
Wow.
That in that time, so it was done. It was just because labor was cheap, and yeah. I don't know. They tell me that it was unbelievably important to the people here, and that caught on across the country. And I don't know if it was man against nature. I don't know if it was country against country, or what it was that caught the imagination of the public, but it certainly did.
Yeah, the readings I've read relative to the Bluenose legacy tells a couple of truths of the day. In one of the series of the races, the America's Cup was going on. And in the technology of the day, the radio was what people listened to if they weren't, in order to get it on a moment-to-moment basis rather than the newspapers. And there was a tremendous amount of dichotomy between those interested in the America's Cup and those interested in the fishing races. And it was the working person who was really dialed into the fishing story on both sides of the border, and so that was. And there's a lot of poo-pooing of the America's Cup stuff because they were very careful about how much wind they would sail in, and the fishing vessels, they weren't at all bothered by any of that. So the imagination was captured. And in part, the technology helped with that, is my understanding. The radio, being able to live it like a baseball report. You could have announcers talking about the races.
They did, and I know even in Halifax, they would string wires across the street and have model boats that they would push out one in front of the other as radio reports came in, so that even people without radios could see what was going on and who was ahead of the marks. Yeah, it must have been. I guess the World Series maybe, or the Super Bowl is, to capture, or for us, Stanley Cup,
right?
Olympics maybe, to capture that many people's attention at one time. I don't know if that happens anymore.
Right. Yeah. When did the original become non-commercial in the sense of what was the transition between the original and then the next vessel to replace her and keep the legacy going? When did that occur?
So original was sold out of Lunenburg in '43. So she was, as most of the schooners here, a lot of the schooners here, sold into the Caribbean trade. So topmast off, wheelhouse on, bigger engine, cargo carrying her, and she sank off Haiti in '46. So there really was nothing, I guess, until the Bounty came along. So Bounty was built in '61, was it, or somewhere there? Yeah. So I think '61 here in Lunenburg, and that really ignited people's interest here. That although they were building modern vessels, wooden vessels here, scallop draggers and fishing vessels, that the idea that you could build a wooden sailing vessel here, still do it, sort of lit the imagination of people. I guess a delegation went to the Olin Brewery, to the Olin family, Colonel Sidney, and they were selling Bluenose beer, lager beer. Got the picture of the ship on the can and said, you can use it as a promotional vessel for yourself, but we need to have a Bluenose sailing again. And so in '63, the Olins said yes, and they built the vessel. So they ran it as private charter, family boat, promotional vessel from '63 until '71. And I think by the time '71 came around, the boat needed a refit, a fairly substantial one, which is within keeping of the boats here. The fishing schooners here were historically 10 or 15 years. They're built with red oak, often planked with birch below the waterline. So this is not white oak and Angelique we're talking about. This is, right.
Yeah.
This is wood that's disposable. This is just a tool.
Right.
Right. So, and in the lumber trade, there's certainly stories of that, they would build a boat, fill it with lumber, and it would sail from Yarmouth or wherever, and that would be the last of it. So the boat would pay for itself, the lumber was the profit, and just take the whole thing as a package deal, and you're done.
Wow. Yeah.
So anyway, that was '63, '71, the province took over. And it's the story is that it was $1, it was paid in 10 dimes. That was the price of the boat. But as you know, with wooden boats, sometimes free is too much money. So they had to sink money in it right away to do a refit and bring her back up to stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it goes. When did you get involved, and what was she doing when you got involved?
Much the same as she does now. So I started in '87 as a deckhand. We don't have the blessing that you guys do with all kinds of ships to go on, and you can sort of spiral up your career. Here it has to be a spike. There's one ship on the East Coast. It certainly was at that time, and so you become a one-ship wonder, I guess, if you're going to stay within Canada. So in '87 I joined. So you're doing probably at that time 150 harbor tours a year, traveling to festivals. So you do a spring trip maybe down to Norfolk Waterfront Festival or Baltimore or New York or wherever, often to promote the province for tourism and for business. And then come back, and in high season in the summer, you travel around Nova Scotia and do harbor tours and do port visits at festivals. And then in the fall, sometimes back down to the States, sometimes up into the Great Lakes to Montreal or Toronto. So same as you do now.
Well, were you aboard her when she went out to the Pacific?
I came on the year after. That was in '86. Then she went to the Pacific.
And the reason she went to the west coast of Canada was what?
That was Expo '86, World Exposition in Vancouver. Yeah. Lots of good stories out of that trip.
I'm sure. And the recent big trip is the Great Lakes last year. You guys went up there. So how did that work out in hindsight?
I really wish I'd had the topmast off last year instead of this year. It's like we had, I think, 120,000 people across the decks for the year.
And how does that compare if you had not gone in?
So if we'd have been here on the coast, probably 50,000 maybe, somewhere between 40 and 60 in a year. So, you're doubling to tripling your social media stuff, your in-person stuff. I think I did 100 media interviews last year. So it's a great way to promote the boat and to take the boat sort of into the heartland of North America. And if you look at where our tourism comes from here, East Coast and the Great Lakes region are huge for us. Good chance to put the ship and the province on TV. And we have this argument all the time. Do you want the boat to stay in Lunenburg and do harbor tours because people come to see the boat? But if you don't take the boat to them, they'll never know the name of the boat. So it's like, can you or I name the name of a harbor tour schooner in Toronto or Baltimore or... We still in? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you need to go and try, as you guys well know, that you've got to go and then show the flag in these places.
Yeah, that's the reputation connection. The renown of the vessel is by taking advantage of the vessel as the ambassador itself. It's always great experience to be aboard, but in the end, what they remember, except on a personal level, but the general memory is the vision of the vessel. I saw her here. I remember her when I was there. And then at home, you get that argument about, well, I saw her in the newspaper. She was over there. Now she's home. And so you get that story from a local. And then, of course, every once in a while, somebody says, well, why do you leave home? Why don't you stay at home? It's always a stressor. We see that stress. It's a balancing act all the time. When Pride went out to Asia in 1998, the conversation for 1 to 3 years ahead of that was after the feasibility of it. And of course, sure, we can go out there, says the captain, boldly. and then, can you do it in less than a year? Well, okay, less than a year. How much less than a year? Well, you tell us, because we like it to be less than a year, because they're from their perspective, the promotional perspective, they see that drain away, that effort to keep the locals mindful of their boat becomes harder and harder and harder and harder, even though there's this wonderful adventure going on and all this proof of gaining reputation and having your awareness, your existence being more aware around the globe. So I was able to figure out how to do it in less than 12 months, but not less than 11 months. And among your and my colleagues, I was teased about, you got halfway around, why didn't you finish the job? And I nodded with understanding, but the bottom line was you couldn't go all the way around in less than in a year. It would be more than a year. So, yeah. But you could when you came back. So, and of course we could visit the West Coast. We could not have gone to Asia and include the West Coast, but we could include the West Coast coming back. So so those logistics were answered. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of the Bluenose for sailing. I mean, that's a lot of people in my world, our world, say that's a huge mainsail. And then when you take it down, what is life like when you're under the foresail and the headsails and no topsails and the main is down? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a huge main. I think the boom is 81 feet long. It weighs somewhere around 3,500 pounds. So, you've got to pay pretty good attention to your shock loading and and to the boat will stand up this year. We had 35 knots in a quarter, sailing along under 4 lowers, doing sort of 11.5 or 12 knots. just fantastic. But the problem becomes as the seas begin to build and you've got this green crew, is how do you get the damn thing down? How do you deal with it? I mean, the gaff alone is 1,100 pounds and I think 54 feet long or something. So you got all of a sudden you go from sailing along nicely to all these uncontrolled weights with someone who didn't even know what a gaff was 4 months ago holding a line about it. So I am conservative. I'll push the boat at times, but I'm very understanding of what the skill level is on the boat when things go wrong.
Yeah, so to get into the weeds just a tiny bit about that main boom, with Pride of Baltimore's raked lower masts, almost 15 degrees leaning back, when the boom goes out for broad reach, the boom is going up higher and higher and higher. Whereas with next to no, probably zero rake for next to zero rake for Bluenose II, when that boom goes out, angle of heel, there's no additional rise except maybe dynamically with the leech lifting up and the gaff going forward and the boom still yet to catch up. There might be a little rise, but so how sensitive, how much caution do you have to apply relative to the angle of heel under what you just described, which was that broad reach of 30 plus knots and 12 knots in terms of wind, and then 12 knots with the boat?
Yeah, we actually shortened the leech up a little bit this time when we made the sail, just to lift that boom up some. Because I have had, I sailed down the St. Lawrence one time dragging the boom in those same conditions, and it's just horrible. It really is. As the ship rolls down and the last 10 feet of the boom disappear into the waves, and then the whole thing, so it drags back, and then you roll up, and the whole thing loads forward. And
what kind of angle heel is the roll range then, do you think?
We dip our deck at about 15 degrees.
And when do you
so you're looking at the boom probably like 18 or 19 degrees, somewhere there, maybe 20. Yeah. Before the rail goes under, but not a whole lot.
But after the deck edge has gotten wet.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. No, we don't have that problem. Our deck edge wet is 2021, and I don't think we've ever seen the boom go in the water unless a wave has peaked up and grabbed it. We've had that happen where the boat's rolling over and a crest is real big or lump because of angle, and so we've had that happen. Do you ever use a preventer to hold the boom out?
We do. We have a preventer underneath the boom, and we do use it. Certainly in those conditions, we put it on, and you're worried about dragging the boom off the ship as well as the shock loading back and forth. So we do. We rig it. If the boat jives, if the boom comes across, then everything that preventer's hooked on is coming with it.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen the rail peeled off and lifelines and the whole works.
Yeah, we have to use the preventer in very light air, inclusive of using it in heavier air for reasons that you described, keeping the boom from ripping away from the mast if a wave hits it, because of the rake. I mean, in 10 knots of true wind, and we're sailing nicely 6-7 knots on a reach. We go downwind, broaden it to a broad reach. The boom swings back in because of the rake. It's just, even with all our sizable and topmast, it's still not enough to keep the boom from coming in because there's so many degrees of rake. So we have to put the preventer on almost all the time when we're thinking of beam reaching or broad reaching. Yeah, particularly.
Do you lean it forward towards the foremast, or are you on the rail by the main? Or
yeah, we have a pennant that is a fixed pennant. The distance from the fore channel back to the aft end of the aft channel. And when we want to use the tackle, the boom preventer tackle, we'll bring the pennant from a coiled stowed situation up at the fore rig, stretch it behind the shrouds on the main to a temporary hold, until we're ready. And then when we use the tackle, we'll hook up to that. So we have a straight pennant of 30, 35 feet long, going to a 4-part tackle, 2 double shiv blocks, one at the hook, one at the boom, before we bring the tail of the tackle forward to the jaws to hold the boom out. Our boom is nowhere near as heavy as yours, but it's still not light. And with 14, 15 degrees of angle on the rake, that boom doesn't want to go out past the end of the transom. It goes out a bit, but so you still have to have 5, 6 people swaying the line when
Yes.
you want to go out past, say, 30 degrees from the center line. So we never get much past 45 degrees, partly because of the twist of the mainsail. It just doesn't help. You can get out to maybe 50, 60 when you go right to the shrouds, but all the time that boom's getting higher and higher and higher and getting harder and harder and harder, and the crew are sweating and sweating and sweating, wondering when the captain's going to say enough. But you must lose a hell of a lot of. Okay, in that 35 knots, you were thinking about taking down the main.
Yeah.
Now you're down to foresail and headsails. What does the boat feel like then? Underpowered by a lot?
No, I would often put up the trysail then, if we've got time and distance, and so motor sailing. If I'm just trying to get somewhere, with motor sailing, we'll do a 4 and jumbo, and you don't notice it. 4 jumbo, rider and jib. She'll slide along at 6 or 7 knots in 20 knots of wind, and that's lovely. We do our passage planning at 6 or 7 knots, so you can still maintain your schedule.
Wow.
The cook's not complaining. The crew aren't seasick. I don't have 3,500 pounds or 5,000 pounds swinging around over my head, and I don't have to leave that with a green mate. And
that's interesting.
Yeah,
6 or 7 knots. So we use a speed of advance of around 4.5 knots, 3.7. So we're basically a division of 110 miles a day when we're coastal, and then we use 130 miles when we're crossing oceans. And we put a big emphasis on what she can do given the normal. I have a funny reflection. I sailed the old boat. Arm and Alcesser had established 100 miles a day as a scheduling rule, and I get to the second boat, and we're somewhat bigger. I think the waterline length went from 67 to 91, something like that. And I'm thinking we're going to go. So I'm using 130 miles around the coast. And I learned from a board member about a year and a half later, says, I understand you're doing a lot of motoring. Apparently, it wasn't the cost of the fuel. It was the other static about, hey, we're not sailing so much. That's the reason why we came to the boat. I don't know how the word got up to there. So I re-examined and realized that the boat might be longer, it might be faster, but the wind hasn't gotten faster.
Yeah.
In the 2 years, it went from the one boat to the next boat. So we dropped back, and we've been running between, say, 60 and 90% of the campaigns have been under sail. Great Lakes, of course, were way down, like because of the rivers and stuff. But cool. Wow. Hey, Jeff, do you happen to have a question I haven't covered?
Sure. To kind of wrap this up, what is the Bluenose going to be doing for 2021? Kind of the idea.
So the idea is it's the 100th anniversary of the launch and the first win of the beginning of the legacy of Bluenose, the original Bluenose and Captain Angus, and so we're hoping to celebrate that. And so that means that here in Lunenburg, there's Folk Harbor Music Festival, there's Literature Festival, Docudrama Festival. yeah, you name it, and they're all going to put a Bluenose or schooners twist on all their festivals. We're hoping to have the schooner festival, so that I think we'd really love to have you guys come visit. We'd love. I think Bowden is Bowden's 100th anniversary. I think next year. So we're hoping she'll show up. And the HMCS Oriole, the Canadian Navy's sail training vessel, is 100 years old. So we're hoping she'll come as well. Yeah, Nova Scotia Schooner Association, and then so that's sort of the things that will be around Lunenburg. And then we've got a little traveling museum that goes with us. I don't know if you saw it in the Great Lakes there, and I hope to take that around to communities in Nova Scotia and do much of what we did this year, but also visit and take the history back to these communities. You know, the Bluenose is the surviving Grand Bank schooner, but she can't be, or she shouldn't be just the one thing. She shouldn't just be the racing boat. She's got to be representative of the 30-foot inshore fishing schooners and the big Grand Bank schooners and the races, but also the guys that cut timber and the blacksmiths and the farmers and the people that dry fish. And as you well know, these boats, any boat is not one single thing. It's the top of the pyramid of what it takes to build it and keep it going. And so that's the thing for me, and why I like going back to communities, and so it becomes a focal point of discussion.
Well, your continuity to the whole legacy and continuing on for a long, long time, I hope, Phil, is a very, very critical aspect of that legacy. A one-ship background, there's a lot of history. There's significant history about cabin boys that stayed with the ship throughout their life, became absolutely, exquisitely excellent at their ship without jumping from ship to ship to ship. So, Phil, you're an example of that history in a modern era with even though the restrictions you described that exist up there, the options aren't that great, numerous rather. They're great options, but just not that numerous. So my compliments to you. We've sort of been together a bunch of times over the several years. I guess I don't know. When did you take over as captain?
In 2001 was my first year.
Yeah, so
that was here.
We're going on 20 years doing this. It's been excellent with the Bluenose II. The country is a lot to be proud of in you, Phil.
Well, thank you, and I will say that you and Captain Moreland have been great to take me young captain under their wing, and I've had great mentors, and I try and pass that lesson along to the people that sail with me. So I've learned a lot from you guys in 20 years.
Well, so thank you for taking time out of your day to share your reflections and your knowledge about that. That's been a wonderful addition to our Coffee With program with Pride of Baltimore.
It's a pleasure. I'm going to have to go watch the back episodes now and catch up.
Thanks a lot, Phil.
All right.
Alrighty, folks, I'm going to turn the camera over to Captain Miles here. He has some additional reflections on this interview with Captain Watson.
Hello, everyone. So going back to the business of Bluenose II's mainsail. It's big. I thought it was relevant to discuss the power that represents. So in terms of numbers, the mainsail for the Bluenose II is 37% of the total sail area. Comparing it to Pride, we're only 25% of the total sail area. So when you're sailing along in a big breeze like Captain Phil Watson described, 35 knots building, you're thinking about reducing your mainsail. On Pride of Baltimore II, under exactly similarly described conditions, I wouldn't hesitate to take the mainsail off, running away from the wind. I wouldn't alter the course of the ship. You might have a 10-foot sea or greater. So we just take the sail down. So it's very interesting for me to understand the scale of Bluenose II. So the boom on Pride of Baltimore II is 53 feet long. The boom, as you heard from Captain Phil just now, is 81. The Pride's gaff is 31. And the Bluenose II gaff is 54. So you're in a rolling sea, even as big as Bluenose II is, you're in a heaving sea, trying to get that 4,100 square feet of sail under pressure from 35 knots of wind down when you're running away from the sea is going to be a challenge. But it's rather impressive to me to think in terms of rounding the ship up into the wind. And I called Phil back later this week to sort of explore this with him. And he said, yeah, you know, there'll be times when we'll take the jib down and ahead of a roundup, and then they don't have the ability to actually trim that mainsail under that much pressure. So we're not even trying to trim it. We're just dropping it while the boom is out there when we're running away. And so what he'll do is just take the velocity to the vessel and use that velocity to have her round into the sea. And as big as she is, 10 feet of sea, or possibly even better, you know, first of all, you get everything staged, and then you do the turn, and everybody's sort of strapped in. You just wait for the vessel to get around, and maybe she leans over quite a bit. They're easing some sails, so the angle of heel is not that extreme and coming around with those kinds of breezes, a breeze strength. So anyway, then you're sort of head to wind, and you can drop the thing down, get the boom in because it's not resisting because of sail area with the wind, and get it center line, get gaff in because they're big stuff, really big stuff, very heavy. So that was just a really technical, interesting thing for me to ponder. And remember, 38% of the sail area on Bluenose II is all tied up in the mainsail. It's what drives those things as fast as they went in historical terms, particularly their ability to go close reaching, because the fishing grounds were downwind, upwind, relative to their ports quite often. So pretty impressive. So anyway, pardon me, I'm going to turn this back over to Chief Mate Jeff Crosby to close down. Thank you for joining us. And remember, stay diligent.
Alrighty, folks, I just want to, once again, thank you guys for joining us this morning, and a huge shout out to Bluenose II and Captain Phil Watson for joining us. And if all the cards go right, hopefully we'll see you next year for the 100th anniversary of Bluenose II. Thanks, everyone.